I had a chance to interview North Carolina Supreme Court Justice Allison Riggs about the Republican Party's effort to throw out 60,000 votes in her critical statewide Supreme Court race. Now, ask yourself, did you see this covered in any mainstream media? Did some big national newspaper tell you about how Republicans are trying to undermine the will of the voters? No, where you saw it is in Democracy Docket, because it will always cover this kind of important voting and democracy news. It is fearlessly independent. It is unabashedly pro-democracy. If that kind of reporting is important to you, please take a second to support Democracy Docket by clicking the link above and becoming a premium member, supporting its work, getting access to its exclusive content for just $10 a month. Now, on to my interview. Justice Allison Riggs, welcome to Defending Democracy.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for having me.
All right. So you are right now in the midst of a recount, actually, I think a second recount. You won narrowly by 700 votes or so. You'll give us all the details, but you won narrowly your election to the North Carolina State Supreme Court against a Republican candidate. And before people offer comments, the Republican legislature in North Carolina insisted that justices run in partisan elections. So when I say it's the Republican candidate, it is actually the Republican candidate. But you defeated him in the initial count, and then there was an initial recount, and you again defeated him. And as I understand it, we are now in the midst of another recount. So can you just give people an update on what is going on and what the sort of current status is?
Right. So after the counting of all absentee ballots in North Carolina, which doesn't all happen on election night, and the counting of all provisional ballots in North Carolina. And remember, this was the first election, general election, where we had a voter ID requirement. So people were casting more provisional ballots because of that. After all of that was done, I was ahead 734 votes. My opponent, because the margin was so small, was allowed under law to request a recount. I have no problem with that. Recounts are a good, normal process, and I want people to have faith in the outcome of even tight elections. So he requested a machine recount out of about 5.6 million votes cast. The margin after the machine recount was exactly the same. 734
Amazing.
votes. That's 100 counties in North Carolina. We're the state with the third most counties behind Georgia and Texas. So got 100 counties. It's a real testament to how well run our elections are here in North Carolina, that margin stayed exactly the same. Under North Carolina law, my opponent was entitled to ask for a sample hand recount, where about 3% of polling places across the state in all 100 counties poll workers will conduct a hand-to-eye recount. So they will have 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats look at each ballot, call out the numbers. That process is still underway. We expect it to finish maybe later today, but more likely on Monday. If there were some discrepancies in that would call into question the statewide recount, which we don't anticipate because all of the counties that have finished so far have been right on track, right on target, then he would be able to request a complete statewide hand-to-eye recount. But long-winded way of saying we're nearing the end of this recount process. And, everyone should be taking away the fact that we count every vote that's lawfully cast. We want to get it right, not fast. And things are going in a way that should just create a ton of trust in the election process. I have no quibble with the recounts. What is also happening is my opponent filed over 300 election protests challenging the validity of over 60,000 votes cast in this election, including ballots cast by my parents. My dad is a 30-year military veteran who registered to vote in person using his military ID. It's not that it's my parents, it's that I obviously have their stories to explain how problematic this is. But we should not be weaponizing the systems that exist to defend election mechanisms and election integrity. We shouldn't weaponize it to avoid conceding in an election you lose. And so the reason I'm here talking to you today, and the reason I want folks to understand what's happening in North Carolina, is there are 60,000 innocent voters who did everything that they were supposed to do, and my opponent wants their ballots to be tossed.
Yeah, and this is the reason why I wanted to have you on. I do a lot of post-election recounts and contests, and as you point out, it is very unusual that you're going to see a significant number of votes move between candidates, between a machine recount and a hand recount. I can have a whole debate with people on the right about which is actually more accurate, but that's neither here nor there. As you say, no one should be penalized for wanting a complete count, including a recount. But the reason why I wanted to have you on is I have been, frankly, beside myself with rage about the fact that your opponent is seeking to disenfranchise 60,000, more than 60,000 voters in the state of North Carolina. It is one thing, as you say, to ask for ballots to be counted and recounted, but the effort to wholesale disenfranchise tens of thousands of voters who, as you said, did everything right. They didn't make a mistake. They didn't do anything wrong. And to say that somehow they should have their ballots, having gone to the trouble of voted and done everything necessary to vote, to have their ballots discarded, I just find to be a complete outrage. I've posted on social media about it. I've written about it. I've actually been on MSNBC national media talking about it. And I wish there was more attention in the national media to what this is, because it is exactly, in my view, of a piece of what was everyone rightly condemned after the 2020 election, which was this effort for a losing candidate, in that case Donald Trump, to sort of disregard, not challenge a ballot here or there, but this mass challenge. So tell us a little bit about what the challenge, what's his theory? Understanding, I have laid the predicate, you could agree with it or disagree with that, it is, in my view, inexcusable. What makes up this huge number of ballots?
Yeah, so there's actually several different bases for his election protests, but the bottom line is they've all already been rejected by bipartisan votes on the State Board of Elections or by federal and state courts.
Okay.
So these are zombie challenges, resurrection of challenges that have been rejected already after an election, seeking to undo the will of voters as expressed in the election total. So it ranges from arguing that if a voter's file in our election database system doesn't in that database have driver's license number, the last four of a social security number, that somehow that voter registration is incomplete. That's not what the Help America Vote Act requires. No. People here, we have same-day registration in North Carolina. It's where people can register to vote in person during early voting. So it's not a by mail registration. And we are required, when you register via same-day registration, to present one form of identity document and one proof of residency. So just to use an example, because it's someone that I know everything that he did, when my father went to register to vote, he presented his military ID and he presented a utility bill that had his name and his current address on it. That is totally lawful. He has done everything that he needed to do, but military IDs don't have a driver's license number on them, obviously, or a social security number. Same with passports. There are forms but we know my dad is who he said he was. There aren't any issues regarding his eligibility to vote. And so my opponent wants to make people think that there is some piece of missing data that is not missing. So imply that there's something wrong with the registration and then put the burden on the voter to make sure that they were trying to cure something that wasn't even wrong to begin with, to have their vote counted. It's very frustrating. And, normally I would not speak about pending litigation, but I am still a candidate in this race.
Yeah.
And this is about whether or not the people of North Carolina get to pick who serves on the Supreme Court for the next 8 years.
Yeah, and you mentioned something that I noticed was also one of their challenges. And this is, by the way, something we saw before the election, both in North Carolina and around the country, the effort to disenfranchise people who have served in the military or serving in the military or overseas voters. And there was actually litigation, as I think you were alluding to, before Election Day in North Carolina that I think the Republican Party brought and failed to try to challenge a category of people who are covered by this federal law called the UACAVA law and a state law analog. Does it surprise you that in addition to saying someone who uses a military ID to register to vote, I mean it's kind of ironic, right? I mean, over all the fights that I've had, and you've undoubtedly seen, over ID, pretty much the passport and military IDs are usually like the sacrosanct ones for the Republican Party, which is involved in this effort on the other side, attacking this. Does it surprise you that they are willing to target this sort of subcategory of people who are covered by these federal and state laws?
What I will say as a sitting judge, but as someone who spent my career defending constitutional rights, including the right to vote, is I think we can have a values-based discussion about how people approach election litigation and post-election litigation. And so I think there are questions for the public about are there folks trying to ensure that every lawful ballot is counted, or are there folks trying to en masse ensure that numbers of votes are not counted? Because I think particularly when you're asking to serve as a judge, that's an important job qualification. Do you hold sacred that constitutional right to vote? And I certainly don't, I come from a military family. I have deep respect and honor for that service. My dad would be the first one to tell you that his right to vote is no more precious than someone who's never served in uniform, that every vote counts. And there is something to be said, something troubling about an attack on families, on service members and on families who are serving overseas. That is the hardest kind of service. My family, my father was deployed in war. My brother was deployed in war. These are families who are going through hard things, or even if they're just stationed in, at foreign bases, that's a point at which we as a country ought to be supporting them, not making it harder for them to have their voices heard. And I think I want to make sure that everyone understands what's happening, that the ability of military voters and their families is under attack in this post-election dispute, where after 2 counts, a count and a recount, and most of the way through a second recount, I've won this election, that we're bringing innocent people who are serving their country into this debate and dispute in a way that would undermine a fundamental right of theirs. And it should be troubling to everyone.
So the other thing that I find really disturbing about these challenges, and again, the recount, I think candidates should avail themselves of recounts in close elections. They don't usually change the outcome. They didn't change the outcome here, but stranger things have happened. But one of the things about the challenges here that I find perplexing as a legal matter is, usually if you have a race that's decided by 700 votes, 800 votes, 400 votes, whatever it is, you might see challenges of 1,000 votes. You might see this 60,000 jumps off the page because it is such an excessive number. In other words, it almost feels like it is it is not motivated just by an effort to win this election, but to actually set up a framework, which again, we saw Republican candidates do after 2020. Kerry Lake did it in Arizona. Obviously, Donald Trump did it in 2020. To sort of say, when I lose, when I, Republican candidate, lose, it's not like I lost because there were like a dozen votes here or 100 votes there, but there were 60,000 votes. Do you know what I mean? And does it surprise you, or do you have anything to offer, like I said, either as a candidate, if not, probably not as a lawyer, but as a candidate, like what message he is sending by challenging so many voters?
Yeah. So what I can say is when I was in private practice, when I was a voting rights and election attorney, it was troubling that 2020 seemed to present this new shift in post-election litigation and disputes. I wouldn't go so far as to say had never happened before, but it seemed to be happening on a scale that was really disturbing. And to see it continued 4 years later worries me, particularly if we don't feel a sense of worry about this. Like this is not a couple voters here or there with facts to support it or not. But I mean, the scale of this is deeply troubling to me. And the idea that it can be that people are suggesting that this is a normal, acceptable, reasonable kind of debate to be having in post-election protests. I mean, this is the kind of thing that I worry as a candidate I want people to vote. I want people to be heard because they believe that their vote matters. And I've been saying nonstop, I never want to hear anyone who voted in my race to say that their vote doesn't matter. 734 out of 5.6 million, your vote mattered an awful lot. I want to encourage that kind of confidence and sense of importance of each person and their civic participation. And I think that the idea that losing candidates can come in after the fact and just say, no, we don't like the outcome of this election, like there was some mass problem, when it's not true, but keep doing it over and over again in a way that inures people to these claims, it's right. Very concerning to me and the future of our democracy.
Yeah, and so I'll say, and I won't ask you to comment, that the fact is, this is a relatively new phenomenon in our country. I mean, the fact is, even a few years ago, I was involved in representing candidate Dan McCready, who was a member of who was running in a House race. Mark Harris was a Republican, and there was an issue involving Bladen County and whether ballots were properly collected and whether there was election fraud. There wound up being a new election held as a result. But, in that we felt a keen obligation to not just say pox on North Carolina. We were saying these are the individual votes. These are the individual ballots. And that is because traditionally or historically, if you want to challenge the outcome of an election, you bear not just a legal burden, but you bear a moral burden of not trying to cast doubt on the entire election. You're not here to say the election, was unspecifiedly bad, right? You're here to say here were 5 votes, here are 5 voters, and I can actually show those individuals. And in 2020, what we saw was Donald Trump do something very, very different, and to basically say, we need to throw out all of these ballots. We need to disenfranchise all those voters. And we saw that like I said, in 2022 with Kerry Lake in Arizona and elsewhere. And this very much feels that same way to me, where, saying that 60,000 North Carolinians, it is implausible. I mean, even under the most strained thing, it is implausible to believe that 60,000 voters in North Carolina somehow were doing something wrong. And the fact that he included your parents, has this very kind of Trumpian feel to it, that what he's doing is setting up a permission structure so that when he loses and you are sworn in again, and I will be the first to celebrate that, that he's able to say, oh yeah, look at all this crazy stuff. So for many people who are not in states that elect judges, it is an odd thing to hear that you elect judges. So tell us, what is it like to run for judicial office? And like, what is a judicial campaign about? Assume you are talking to someone who is in a state that is used to the way they do it, like in federal judges where it's, appointed. So like, what is what are there campaign issues? Like, is it about like rules of, like, is it like, oh, I will change the response dates for the rules of procedure? Like, what is a judicial election like?
Yeah, so North Carolina in our Constitution requires the election of judges. So it's not a policy decision. It's based in our Constitution. The way in which we elect judges over time has changed. So I ran in a partisan judicial election. 2018 was the first time we had partisan judicial elections way back when. Democrats changed it to be nonpartisan judicial elections, and then the Republicans changed it back to make them partisan judicial elections. But not every state has that constitutional requirement, or some may choose have different policies. But it is surprising to a lot of people when I go to other states. And it still can be surprising to North Carolina voters. I mean, there are people who are engaged in electoral politics or civic, are involved in their communities and civic engagement groups, may ask me as a judicial candidate, what are your platforms?
Right, yeah.
And so I all the time for 2 years that I was campaigning, I would frequently have to counter questions with I'm running as a judge, so I can't promise that I have policies. I can't tell you like a legislator can say how they will vote on an issue, promise the voter how they'll vote on an issue, and then be held accountable. I cannot do that under our rules of judicial conduct. But the way I've approached this problem of trying to defend the integrity of the courts, the institution that I believe so deeply in, because I believe our legal system has the promise of righting wrongs and equaling the playing field and delivering an equal measure of justice to every single person who walks in the courthouse doors. I believe in that institution, in that system. So I have to prioritize that on one hand, but then on the other hand, I have to run in a partisan judicial election, and I have to get 50% plus one people in the state to vote for me. And so the way I've described this as a balance beam or threading the needle. I have to be so thoughtful about everything I say to try and balance that. But what I've done is I focused on my values. And this goes back to, you can learn a lot from someone through their acts, by their behavior. I think right now you're seeing a lot about my values and my opponent's values. How precious do you treat a North Carolinians, a U.S. citizen's constitutional right to vote? Is it precious? Is it something that you defend with every fiber of your being? I consider that to be part of what my charge is as a judge. But I'll just say my campaign for 2 years was marked by having to kind of reshape the expectations of voters I communicated with. And I'm fine with that. I consider, the judiciary is the least known of the political branches. And I'm happy for part of my job to be one of public education. I think when people it's better when people cast informed ballots, when I can give them information about what should you expect from your judges and from your courts? Like, what would it look like, the ideal? And then how do you compare the candidates and the incumbents to that ideal? I think that's something I'm proud to have part as my job now and was part of my campaign. But it's always a delicate conversation with voters because they may not fully understand what questions are the best ones to ask a judge to learn about them and not, try and not accidentally get them off the path of what judicial standards requires.
Yeah. So let me ask you a final question, which I think you're uniquely qualified to answer. In full disclosure, you and I knew each other because you were a very, very prominent voting rights lawyer. I'm sure you were prominent for a lot of other things, but in the area of voting rights, you were one of the most prominent lawyers in the country. And I am constantly asked by people in this moment, there is a lot of despair, and people want to give up on democracy, give up on voting. They feel like, the U.S. Supreme Court, whatever. They are in a really fragile place. And the thing I always tell them is that the cynics want you to believe that the courts won't help. But the fact is, the courts are there to protect democracy. And yes, it is true that they are imperfect. Like, I'm the first one to say, I am regularly disappointed by what some courts do in some cases, but that I can also tell you from private practice that the places where where the courts have stood up. I mean, the fact is, I just interviewed the other day congressman-elect from Alabama who was able to be in that seat because of the work that voting rights lawyers did and that the courts did. That a 3-judge panel in Alabama, comprised of 2 judges appointed by Donald Trump, redrew the lines under the Voting Rights Act in Alabama. So you've lived this, both the hearing the disappointment, hearing the wins, the difference it can make. And I'm sure as a candidate for office and as a judge, you have seen it from that perspective. So what do you, if you were talking to voters or citizens, whether they're in North Carolina or around the country, who just don't know whether the courts will do anything to protect democracy, what do you say to them?
I can say, my 15 years in private practice up through the end of 2022, consistently and across all of the areas of law in which I practiced, one thing was true is when I had clients or community partners who were frustrated and who were harmed in some way, when they would come to me, it was usually because they wanted to go to court. They wanted an independent judiciary to recognize their harms and do something to fix it. And it didn't mean that there was not also some criticism and some frustration with the courts, but I think by and large, even through the end of my private practice career, the courts were on a pedestal, and people recognized throughout the civil rights movement, it was federal courts at that point who were willing to step in and do the right thing, even when state courts or political actors weren't willing to. So I think it's important for, I think, the legal community and for those of us who would consider ourselves to be avid court watchers, and to remember that there's a lot of people who still believe and who need to believe that the way this country was set up, maybe not perfect, but had some really great ideas, and the aspirations were incredibly noble. And so to me, that's part of why I can't write off this important branch of the government. It's why I'm not an advocate anymore. I'm not a litigator. But when I was, I knew how important judges were, that they be people of good character, that they have generous temperaments, that they be rigorously curious about the law and the facts of a case, and just interested in learning and getting it correct. And so I always knew that was something that was incredibly important. And I think for me personally, the harder it's gotten, the more frustrated I felt, the more it challenged me to not give up, to think outside the box, to try something different, and ask myself, where are my skills and my talents and my time needed the most? And I want people, because I saw and lived the optimism and the belief that so many of my clients had in the judiciary, this was an opportunity when I was appointed. It was an opportunity for me to deliver on those ideals, to say I can be everything that those folks had so much faith in, and I can make the courts accountable and present and in relationship with the people that we ask to entrust us with this kind of power. And so it's just, I think when there are hard and frustrating times, people need to take their rest. They need to take care of themselves. But but giving up isn't an option. Reconsidering your approach to the problem, being curious and investigative and experimental, even those are all good things. We want people to be critical thinkers, but I hope that people see me, my campaign, and my service on the bench as something that ultimately reinforces the faith that they've long held in the judiciary, and see it as me doing my part to move us back to that stable place of respect for this branch.
Well, Justice Riggs, I certainly see you that way, and I know the audience does. And I want to thank you for your service in private practice, your service on the court, and also, though most importantly, again, the reason why I had you on here is, your exemplary behavior during what is a very, very difficult process. I mean, I have been with candidates in the moments where they are up a little, they're down a little, they're not sure where it is, and those are really hard. And you have shown remarkable grace during that process for the people of North Carolina. And as I said, if you were the one saying throw out 60,000 votes, I'd be quite critical. But you are the one who is standing up on the right side of history here. And so I want to thank you for coming. I hope you will keep us updated as things go, because we want to amplify this information as we have and will continue to do. And good luck.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks for watching this episode of Defending Democracy. Please subscribe to its free daily and weekly newsletters to stay up to date on the latest voting rights and democracy news. We'll see you next time. Defending Democracy is a production of Democracy Docket, LLC.